Before we get into this video, I just want to give my disclaimer. I mean no harm or disrespect to anyone involved or affected by the contents of this video. This is all information I have gathered online and I'm compiling into this one video. Elizabeth Short was born on the 29th of July 1924 at Hyde Park, Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States. Born to Cleo and Phoebe Short, Elizabeth's father Cleo built miniature golf courses as this was a new thing back then. But in 1929, Cleo's depression caught up with him and he abandoned Elizabeth, her 4 other siblings, and her mother, Phoebe. Cleo faked his suicide so his family would not try to find him, when in actual fact he had just moved and started a new life. Elizabeth Short's nickname was the Black Dahlia. The nickname was given to her by her friends. Elizabeth was nicknamed the Black Dahlia as around that time there was a new movie called the Blue Dahlia. Elizabeth wore a lot of black clothing, and this is why her friends began calling her that. The nickname stuck with Elizabeth, hence the name of this case being the Black Dahlia murder. Years on, Elizabeth's father wrote her a letter confessing he had faked his suicide and was now living in California. He also apologized for what he had done. A few more years after, Elizabeth's father Cleo invited her to come and live with him in California. Elizabeth always knew she wanted to be a star and to make it big in the acting industry, so she packed a bag and left for California. The relationship between Elizabeth and her father Cleo began to crumble, as Cleo believed she was just a freeloader who didn't clean and was lazy. Cleo ended up kicking Elizabeth out of his house. Elizabeth began to stay and live with other people in California, but everyone said the same thing as her dad, that she was just a freeloader. One man that Elizabeth Short stayed with was Robert Red Manley. Robert claims he never slept with Elizabeth as he had a wife and a child, but Robert and Elizabeth did see each other quite a bit, and he was the last person to see Elizabeth before the murder. On the 8th of January 1947, Robert drove Elizabeth to the Biltmore Hotel in California, where they had dinner. The both of them went up to their room. Robert slept on the bed, whilst Elizabeth slept on a chair, as according to Robert, she wasn't feeling well. The next day, Robert was leaving the hotel when he saw Elizabeth in the lobby making phone calls, and Robert claims this was the last time he saw Elizabeth. On the 15th of January 1947, a woman named Betty Bersinger left her home in Los Angeles and was walking to an auto repair shop with her daughter. As they walked up the street, there was a corner of Norton and 39th, and Betty saw what she thought was a mannequin, but as she got closer, she realized this was a human body. The body's mouth was cut into a big smile. She was severed in half, and the body was so pale due to all of the blood being drained out. And this is why Betty thought it was a mannequin. As Betty realized it was a body, she grabbed her daughter and ran to the nearest house where she called the police. When the police got to the scene, there was a huge crowd around the body, so police covered it up. The police took fingerprints and were able to identify the body to be that of Elizabeth Short. Police also checked for sperm to see if she had been raped, as her body was laid out in a sexual way, but nothing was found. To this day, the case still remains unsolved. Police and detectives believe she was murdered somewhere else and then the body was placed. Police also wonder if this is why the body was cut in half to transport it. There was no blood on Elizabeth's body or around her, so this shows she was not murdered where she was found. Elizabeth's father, Cleo, refused to identify the body, so Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, had to fly out to identify the body of her daughter. Phoebe did not find out about her daughter's death until a reporter phoned her up wanting more information about Elizabeth. The reporter told her Elizabeth had won a beauty contest and that they were needing some more information on her. At the end of the phone call, the reporter told Phoebe that her daughter had actually been murdered, and that is why they were phoning and needing more information. 9 days after Elizabeth's body was found, a letter was sent to the police, and inside was magazine cuttings spelling out a message. It read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The letter was spelt out with magazine clippings to hide the handwriting of whoever was sending this letter. The letter was also covered in gasoline, which removes any fingerprints left on the paper. The letter included some of Elizabeth's belongings, such as her birth certificate, social security number, photos that belonged to her, and an old address book. Only one other thing was sent to the police, which was another letter, this time handwritten, that read, "Had my fun with the police. From the Black Dahlia Avenger." Nobody turned themselves in. There are a couple of suspects. Robert Red Manley was the last person to see Elizabeth, but Robert had already returned home to San Diego, and Elizabeth's body was found later than Robert was with her. Robert also passed a polygraph test. After the polygraph test, Robert was ruled as no longer being a suspect, but his life completely derailed after this. A lot of people believed Robert was the culprit, and eventually his wife had to send him to a mental facility as Robert's mental state was deteriorating due to the accusations. Another suspect was Joseph DeMays. Joseph claims he was blackout drunk with Elizabeth a few days before her death. Joseph originally confessed to murdering Elizabeth, but police managed to determine that it was not Joseph who murdered Elizabeth, as he was clocked in at a military base on that day. So this was a false confession from Joseph. There was also some anonymous calls to the police station claiming they murdered the Black Dahlia, and some callers even said it was the police who murdered the Black Dahlia, and all of this was a massive cover-up. There is a lot of theories and ideas of what happened to Elizabeth and who murdered her. There is a third suspect named George Hodel. The reason people believe George was the murderer is due to the fact that his son has been trying to prove that his father murdered Elizabeth Short. George's son said there was a secret room in his father's house where no one was ever allowed to go, and he never found out what it was. George has since passed away, but his son is still determined to prove his father guilty. George attended medical school, and his son believes this is how he knew to surgically cut the body and drain all of the blood. George had 5 wives and 11 children. His son Steve recalls his father had a picture of Elizabeth Short in his possessions. The photo was examined in 2014, and the police were 95% sure that the picture was Elizabeth Short. Before George passed away, police suspected him of murder, and they put listening devices throughout his home. Through the devices, they heard George say, "I'd like to get a connection made in the DEA's office." People believe this means he was paid off by police, but this has never been confirmed. George was also caught saying, "Suppose I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." Steve Hodel returned to his childhood home with the help of cadaver dogs. The dogs did pick up scents of bodies throughout the house. This may not have just been Elizabeth's body parts. This could also mean George could have been a serial killer, and this could explain a lot of unsolved cases, although this is just theory. The LA District Attorney came forward and said, based on the results of Steve's investigation, I would have no reservations about filing 2 accounts of murder against George Hodel. Steve Hodel has since published a book called The Black Dahlia Avenger, The True Story, and I'm sure this book would go into more detail of the findings of Steve's own investigations. So it would definitely be worth a read if you're wanting to find out more information on George Hodel and Steve's investigations. To this day, the case of the Black Dahlia has never been solved, and Elizabeth's killer has never been brought to justice.